She had rehearsed the walk a dozen times in her head, but she had not rehearsed the smell. Thornfield Manor smelled of beeswax and cold stone and something older underneath. Wood smoke, maybe, or the particular damp that settles into walls when a house has stood long enough to remember things. Vivienne Crest had grown up with that smell. She had not expected it to be the thing that nearly undid her, standing in the servants' entrance on a gray October morning with a borrowed valise and a name that was not quite hers. She had given her name as Miss Voss, Anne Voss. It was her mother's maiden name, which felt like the least dishonest thing she could do. The housekeeper who opened the door was a woman of perhaps 50, with the kind of face that had once been pretty and had since become formidable. She looked Vivienne over with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick assessments of people who were likely to disappoint her. "Miss Voss," the woman said. Not a question. "I am Mrs. Renwick. You'll follow me." Vivienne followed. The servants' corridor ran along the east wing, narrow and plain, entirely unlike the wide hallway on the other side of the wall where she had once played as a child. She knew, without looking, that 14 steps down that corridor there would be a door with a brass handle that stuck in damp weather. She knew that the kitchen would smell of bread in the mornings and of something heavier in the evenings. She knew that the window at the end of the passage looked out over the kitchen garden and that in October the rosemary would be going silver and dry. She did not look at the window. "You come from Mrs. Blackwood's agency," Mrs. Renwick said, walking ahead without looking back. It was not a question either. The woman seemed to communicate entirely in statements. "Yes," Vivienne said. "Previous experience? I was companion to Lady Ashton for 2 years. Before that, I assisted in a private household in Edinburgh." Neither of these things was a lie. What she had omitted was the 11 years before that, spent in this house, in the room with the yellow curtains on the 3rd floor, with a governess who smelled of lavender and a father who had called her his best argument against the idea that intelligence was a quality distributed unevenly between the sexes. Her father had been dead for 2 years. His solicitor, Mr. Aldcroft, no, she corrected herself, she was not to think of names she knew, not here, not yet. The solicitor had informed her, with what she could only describe as apologetic precision, that the terms of her father's will were being disputed. Disputed by whom? By her father's brother, her uncle, the man who had appeared at the funeral in a black coat that fit him too well, who had pressed her hand and said, with great feeling, that family must look after family. The will was being disputed on the grounds that her father had not been of sound mind when he signed it. The grounds were, to Vivienne's knowledge, entirely fabricated. But fabrication, as she had learned, could be very patient. It could wait out a young woman's grief. It could wait out her letters and her protests and her visits to solicitors' offices. It could wait, and while it waited, the house could pass into the management of a trustee, and the trustee could invite his business associates to stay, and his business associates could include men who had reason to want the estate evaluated for sale. And one of those men was the Duke of Ashvale. She had not known who he was, not at first. She had learned his name from a newspaper notice 3 weeks ago, in a tea room in London, and she had sat very still for a long moment with the paper in her hands, while the woman at the next table complained about the weather. The Duke of Ashvale, 34 years old, one of the largest landholders in the northern counties. Recently returned from several years abroad, currently residing at Thornfield Manor as a guest of Mr. Dowell, the estate trustee, while he considered whether the property might suit his purposes, her home. She had folded the newspaper very carefully and set it down and drunk the rest of her tea. She had written to Mrs. Blackwood's agency the following morning. Mrs. Renwick stopped before a door and pushed it open. The room inside was small and clean, with a narrow bed and a chest of drawers and a window that looked out over the stable yard. "This is yours," Mrs. Renwick said. "Breakfast is at 6:30. You'll begin with Mrs. Pendleton, the lady's maid, who requires assistance while her own girl is unwell. You'll also take on general duties as required." She paused. "His Grace is particular about order. He is not unkind, but he notices things." "I understand," Vivienne said. Mrs. Renwick looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite suspicion and not quite approval. "You have a sensible look about you, Miss Voss. I hope you'll prove it true." She left. Vivienne sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall and breathed. She had perhaps 3 weeks. That was what Mr. Stanton, her own solicitor, a small, precise man who wore the same brown coat every time she had ever seen him, had told her. The hearing was in 3 weeks. If she could find anything in this house, any document, any letter, any piece of evidence that her uncle had influenced the will or misrepresented her father's state of mind, she might be able to stop the sale. If she could not find it, the estate would go to market. And what her uncle could not take, legally he would take by other means, because men like her uncle were very good at finding other means. She unpacked her valise. She hung her 2 good dresses in the wardrobe. She put her hairbrush on the chest of drawers, and her book on the windowsill, and her father's pocket watch. The one thing she had refused to leave behind. At the very bottom of the valise, beneath everything else, where no one would find it. Then she went to find Mrs. Pendleton and begin her first day as a servant in her own house. The Duke of Ashvale's boots were sitting outside his door at 7 in the morning, caked in mud from what appeared to be a very thorough walk across the grounds. Mrs. Renwick handed them to Vivienne with the expression of a woman who had long since made her peace with the impractical tendencies of people who owned good horses. "He walks the property in the mornings," Mrs. Renwick said. "Every morning, regardless of weather. John usually sees to the boots, but John has gone to the village. You'll manage it." Vivienne looked at the boots. They were excellent boots, she noticed, well-made, expensive, the kind that lasted decades if properly cared for. She had seen her father's boots looked after the same way, by the same man, for 20 years. She took them downstairs. She was sitting in the small room off the kitchen, working at the mud with a brush, when she heard footsteps in the corridor and looked up to find a man standing in the doorway. He was tall. That was the first thing she registered, not his face, not his expression, but simply the fact of his height and the way he filled the doorframe without seeming to try. He was dressed plainly for a man of his rank, in a gray coat and dark trousers, his dark hair still slightly disordered from the morning, and he was looking at her with an expression of faint surprise, as though he had not expected to find anyone there. "I apologize," he said. "I was looking for Mrs. Renwick. She's in the linen room, Your Grace," Vivienne said. She kept her eyes on the boot. There was a pause. "Those are my boots," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." Another pause. She could feel him still standing there, which was unusual. Men of his rank did not generally stand in doorways watching servants work. They moved through houses with the particular ease of people who had never had to think about where anything came from or who did it. "You're new," he said. "Yes, Your Grace. I arrived yesterday. What's your name?" "Voss, Your Grace. Anne Voss." He said nothing for a moment. She kept working. The mud was drying at the edges and needed more attention near the welt. "There's a technique," he said unexpectedly. "If you start from the outside and work in, the mud comes off more cleanly." She looked up then because she could not quite help it. He was watching the boot with a thoughtful expression, not looking at her. "My grandmother's groundskeeper taught me," he said. "I was 7. I had ruined a very good pair of riding boots by doing it the other way." Vivienne looked back down at the boot in her hands. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. "I'll try it." He went away. She sat for a moment with the brush in her hand and thought about the fact that the Duke of Ashvale had just given her advice on boot cleaning, and that his grandmother had apparently had strong opinions about groundskeeping, and that none of this was relevant to why she was here. She finished the boots. She went back upstairs. The house was different from the inside of service. She had known that it would be in an abstract way. She had known that there were rooms she had never entered as a child, passages she had never walked, doors she had always passed without a second thought. But knowing was different from inhabiting. She learned the rhythms of the house in 3 days. She learned that Mrs. Renwick took her tea very strong, and her opinions even stronger. She learned that the footman, a young man named Peter, who seemed to be in a state of permanent mild anxiety, was actually quite efficient when he was not being observed. She learned that the cook, Mrs. Farrow, had a sister in Inverness, and would talk about her at length if you showed the faintest interest. She learned that the Duke of Ashvale breakfasted early and alone, took his correspondence in the library between 9 and 11, rode in the afternoons, and in the evenings sometimes walked the grounds again, alone, which Peter considered eccentric and Mrs. Renwick considered admirable. She learned that her uncle's man of business, a thin, sharp-faced man named Mr. Callow, visited twice in the first week and spent both visits in the study with Mr. Dowell. She could hear their voices through the study door, but not their words, and she did not dare stand too close. She learned that the locked drawer in her father's old desk, the desk that was still in the study, because no one had bothered to move it, was locked with the same small brass key that had always hung on a nail behind the left-hand bookshelf. She found this out on a Wednesday afternoon when Mrs. Renwick sent her to dust the study and Mr. Dowell was out. Her hands were very steady when she took down the key. She was proud of that afterward. She had expected them to shake. The drawer held papers. Most of them were household accounts from years ago, columns of numbers in her father's neat hand. But underneath, folded twice, was a letter. She read it quickly, once, and then again more slowly, because the first time she had not quite believed what she was reading. It was a letter from her uncle to her father, dated 6 months before her father died. In it, her uncle proposed a business arrangement. In the event of her father's death, the estate would be managed jointly, and the daughter, she, Vivienne, would be provided for in a manner her uncle described as generous and appropriate to her situation. There was no mention of the will. There was no mention of the provisions her father had made for her. There was instead a great deal of language about family, obligation, and the difficulty of managing a large property without the proper assistance, and underneath all of it, like something moving in dark water, was a suggestion. The suggestion was that her father might find it easier to simply trust the arrangement to his brother, given his health. Her father, when he had died, had been in excellent health. He had died suddenly, of a seizure, which the doctor had described as unpredictable, and the solicitor had described as tragic, and which Vivienne had not been able, in 2 years of careful thought, to find any reason to attribute to anything other than its apparent cause. But this letter was her uncle proposing the arrangement before her father's health had become relevant, before anyone had reason to think it might become relevant. She refolded the letter. She put it inside her dress against her skin. She locked the drawer and put the key back on its nail and went on dusting the study with hands that were still very steady. She nearly walked into him in the corridor outside the library. She had been thinking about the letter and not watching where she was going, which was the kind of error she could not afford, and she pulled up short just before the collision and said, "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," with her eyes already moving to the floor. "No harm done," he said. Then, "Are you all right?" The question surprised her into looking up. He was watching her with the same expression he'd had in the boot cleaning room. Attentive, slightly puzzled, as though she were a problem he had not yet found the right approach to. "Perfectly well, Your Grace." "Thank you." He didn't move. She could not move past him without him moving first. and she was aware, with some irritation, that he seemed to be taking her answer as a starting point rather than a conclusion. "You've been here less than a week," he said, "and you move through this house as though you know it." Her heart did something she disapproved of. "I've been paying attention," she said carefully. "It's a well-organized house. Most people take longer to learn where things are. I'm a quick study, Your Grace." He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped aside. "Good evening, Miss Voss. Good evening, Your Grace." She walked away and did not allow herself to hurry. The difficulty was that he kept being in places she needed to be. Not deliberately. She understood that. He had no reason to be deliberate about it. He simply moved through the house according to his own patterns, and his patterns occasionally overlapped with hers in ways that required her to either alter her route or find a reason for being exactly where she was. On Thursday, he came into the library while she was dusting the upper shelves, which involved a stepladder and a level of physical commitment she had not anticipated. She climbed down as quickly as dignity allowed and said, "I'll come back later, Your Grace." "You don't have to," he said. He went to his desk and sat down. She stood by the stepladder and considered her options. She went back up the stepladder. She could feel him glance at her occasionally as she worked. He didn't say anything, which she found more unnerving than conversation would have been. After perhaps 20 minutes, he said, without looking up from his papers, "You read." She almost missed her grip on the shelf. "Your Grace? The books," he said. "The way you handle them. You're not just dusting, you're reading the spines." She had not known she was doing it so visibly. "I apologize," she said. "I'll be more careful. I'm not criticizing you." He paused. "What do you read?" She considered lying. It would have been easy to deflect, to give some vague answer that would end the conversation, but she was tired, suddenly, of calibrating every word. "History, mostly," she said. "Property law, when I can find it. Estate management. Silence. Unusual reading for a companion," he said. "I had an unusual education," she said, which was true. He looked up at her then, actually looked the way he hadn't quite before. She looked back from her position on the stepladder, which was an absurd angle for the sort of look she found herself in the middle of. "Miss Voss," he said slowly, as though tasting the name. "Where are you from, originally?" "Yorkshire," she said. The lie was smooth with practice. A small village, you wouldn't know it. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he returned to his papers. "No," he said. "I suppose not." Mrs. Pendleton, the lady's maid, recovered from her illness on the following Monday, which reduced Vivienne's access to the upper floors considerably. She had 3 weeks, now 10 days, and she had 1 letter and a set of household accounts and a growing suspicion that there was something else, something more specific, that she had not yet found. Mr. Callow visited again on Tuesday. This time, he brought papers. She saw them carried into the study under his arm, a leather satchel, fat with documents, the kind that solicitors carried when they were finalizing things. She watched from the corridor as the study door closed. That evening, she sat in her small room and thought carefully. The letter was something. Mr. Stanton had said, the last time she had seen him, that what they needed was evidence of prior arrangement, of her uncle positioning himself before her father's decline. The letter was exactly that. But prior arrangement was not fraud. It was not proof that the will had been altered or that her father's mind had been influenced. It was suspicious. It might not be enough. She needed to know what was in that satchel. She was not going to be able to get into the study again easily. Mr. Dowell had taken to locking it. She thought about this for a long time. Then she thought about what Mrs. Renwick had said about the Duke. That he was particular about order. That he noticed things. She thought about the way he had watched her on the stepladder. She thought about what it would cost her. She picked up her writing things and wrote a letter to Mr. Stanton. She gave it to Peter to post the following morning, with a penny and a request that he not mention it to anyone, which Peter accepted with the earnest discretion of someone who assumed all households contained a moderate number of confidential letters. She found him in the garden on Thursday evening. He was standing near the old yew hedge, looking back at the house, and for a moment she watched him without being seen. A tall man in the fading light, hands behind his back, with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. Thoughtful, maybe, or tired. She stepped forward deliberately so that he heard her on the gravel. He turned. "Miss Voss." "Your Grace, I apologize for disturbing you. You're not disturbing me." He looked back at the house. "I was thinking about the East Wing." She looked at it with him. The East Wing was where her father had kept his study, a different study from the one downstairs, a private one on the second floor that she had not been able to access. She had not known anyone else knew about it. "There's a room up there," he said, "with a broken window." "Mrs. Renwick told me it's been boarded. I was wondering about the view from it. It looks over the moor," she said, without thinking. "The window faces northeast. In the mornings, if the weather is clear, you can see as far as." She stopped. He was watching her. "As far as," he said, very quietly. She looked at the ground. "I'm sorry, I must have misremembered. Mrs. Renwick may have mentioned it." "Mrs. Renwick," he said, "is not in the habit of describing views from second-floor windows." The evening was very still. Somewhere in the garden a bird was making a late, persistent sound. "Miss Voss," he said, "I think you should tell me who you are." She kept her eyes on the gravel. She thought about the letter against her ribs and the hearing in 8 days and the small, careful life she had built in this house over 10 days of pretending. "My name is Vivienne Crest," she said. "This is my father's house." She had not meant to say it quite like that. She had meant to be more careful, more measured, to offer it as information rather than as the thing it was, which was the end of the pretense. But it came out whole, and she could not take it back, and after a moment she looked up. He was watching her with an expression she could not classify. Not anger. Not surprise exactly. Something more complicated than either. "Crest," he said. "Edward Crest's daughter. You knew my father? I knew of him. He was mentioned when Dowell first proposed the estate to me." He was quiet for a moment. "I was told his daughter had contested the will briefly and then withdrawn." "I did not withdraw," Vivienne said. "I was told that the case could not proceed without more evidence, so I came to find the evidence." He said nothing. "I'm sorry," she said, "because it seemed required. For the deception. I did not intend to put you in a difficult position." "What did you intend?" "To save my home," she said simply. The bird went quiet. The last of the light was going off the moor and leaving the garden in the particular gray of early October evenings, and she stood in it and waited for him to say something that would determine what happened next. "What have you found?" he said. She looked up. "I beg your pardon?" "In the house. What have you found?" She considered him. He was watching her steadily, and there was nothing in his expression that she could interpret as hostile, but she was also aware that he was a man who had come here to consider buying the property, and that what she was about to tell him might complicate that considerably. "A letter," she said, "from my uncle to my father 6 months before he died. It proposes an arrangement regarding the estate, one that my father apparently did not agree to, since his actual will named me as sole heir. The letter implies my uncle expected my father's health to deteriorate. Implies. Hughes's language that would only make sense if the writer already knew, or suspected, that his brother would soon be unwell." He was quiet for a long moment. "You said the hearing is 8 days, she said, startled. "I didn't say that." "No," he said. "I calculated. You've been here 10 days. You said 3 weeks when you arrived. Mrs. Renwick mentioned you seemed to be working to some kind of schedule." He paused. "She said you moved like someone who knew where they were going." Vivienne thought about this. "She's very observant," She's been in service for 30 years. She knows the difference between a woman who's lost and a woman who's looking for something. The last light went off the moor. The garden settled into evening around them, and Vivienne stood in her father's garden in her borrowed dress with her borrowed name and thought about the 8 days she had left, and whether this was a catastrophe or something else. "The satchel," she said. "The one Mr. Callow brought on Tuesday. I think it contains the final documents for the sale. If there's anything irregular in them, anything that relies on the will being valid when it shouldn't be." "You need to see them," he said. "Yes?" Another silence. "Then, I have a right to review any documents pertaining to the proposed sale," he said, in the careful tone of a man who was working something out as he spoke. "As the prospective buyer, I can request to see all relevant paperwork before proceeding." She looked at him. "I can do that tomorrow morning," he said. "With Dowell, if there's anything irregular, I'll know what to look for." He paused. "You'll need to tell me what to look for. You would do that?" He looked at her steadily. "Your father's solicitor, Edward Crest's solicitor. He's trying to prove that the will is valid and that the sale should not proceed." "Yes, then the sale should not proceed." He said it simply, as though it were obvious. "Miss Crest, I came here to assess a property. I was not informed that the property was being sold under dispute. I was not told there was a daughter. I was told the matter was settled." He paused. "I don't buy houses built on someone else's loss." She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "There's one more thing," she said, "in the east wing. My father's private study, the one upstairs. I haven't been able to access it. If there are other documents, I'll need the key," he said. "I think Dowell has it." "Then we'll ask Dowell for it," he said, which was the kind of sentence that was easy to say when you were a duke and had never needed to tiptoe around anything in your life, and which she found, at that moment, entirely wonderful. They found what they needed in the private study. It took the better part of the following morning, with the Duke presenting himself to a visibly uncomfortable Mr. Dowell and requesting, pleasantly and without room for negotiation, access to all relevant estate documents. She waited in the corridor, which was an experience she would not recommend, and then the Duke came out and handed her a folded piece of paper without comment. It was a codicil. A second codicil to her father's will, dated a month after her uncle's letter, which added a specific clause. In the event of any dispute over the primary will, the estate was to be independently assessed, and the daughter's claim given precedence. It had been witnessed by 2 men whose names she recognized. It had been properly executed. It had been, somehow, misplaced from the official record, which was to say, it had been removed. She stood in the corridor of her father's house and held the paper her father had written in the last year of his life and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 2 years. "Is it enough?" the Duke asked. "Yes," she said, "it's enough." Mr. Stanton arrived 2 days later. The hearing, when it came, was not dramatic. Vivienne had expected drama. She had been bracing for it. Instead, it was a room full of papers and men in dark coats speaking carefully, and at the end of it the judge said certain words, and her uncle sat across the room with a face like stone, and it was done. The estate was hers. She stood outside the courthouse in the October wind and thought that she should feel something large and significant, and instead felt very tired and very hungry, which seemed more honest. The Duke of Ashvale was waiting at the bottom of the steps. She stopped. He had not needed to be there. He had given his statement to Mr. Stanton's office and been released from any further obligation. And yet he was there, with his hands in his coat pockets and his dark hair misbehaving in the wind, looking up at her. "Well," he said. "It's done," she said. He nodded once, as though he had expected no other outcome. She came down the steps and stood beside him on the pavement in the gray October morning. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I wanted to know how it ended. Now you know." "Yes," he said. He looked at her sideways. What will you do now? She thought about it. She thought about Thornfield Manor in the early mornings, the east wing and the study and the garden and the yew hedge and the rosemary going silver in the kitchen garden. She thought about 2 years of letters and solicitors' offices and borrowed names. Go home, she said. Properly, this time. He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Renwick will be relieved, he said. She's been running that house for 30 years. She'll want someone who knows what they're doing. She'll want to keep running it herself, Vivienne said. I'll be careful not to get in her way. He smiled at that, the first real smile she had seen from him, unguarded and quick. It changed his face considerably. I should like, he said carefully, to call on you when you're settled, if that would be acceptable. She looked at him in the gray morning light, this man who had handed her a codicil in a corridor and said, I don't buy houses built on someone else's loss, as though it were the most ordinary position in the world. I think, she said, that would be acceptable, Your Grace, Aldrich, he said, and then stopped. That is, in private. Eventually. Eventually, she agreed. They stood for a moment in the October wind. Your boots, she said, are going to be in a terrible state when you get back to the country. Almost certainly, he said. Though I understand the technique now is to start from the outside and work in. She laughed, actually laughed out loud, in the middle of the pavement, and it felt like the first real thing she had done in months. She went home. The house was waiting. The garden was hers, and the east wing was hers, and the rosemary in the kitchen garden was exactly as silver and dry as she had known it would be. And in the spring, when the grounds were green again, and the yew hedge was putting out new growth, the Duke of Ashvale came to call, and Mrs. Renwick showed him in with the expression of a woman who had known exactly how this would end. Since the first morning, she had handed a pair of muddy boots to a girl with a borrowed name and eyes that already knew where everything was.